Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Frances Blessum Myers. I'm the youngest of Joan's family with 10 children. I'm talking to you from Minnesota. I can't believe we're not there with you. My sisters and brother, our nieces and nephews, our grandnieces and nephews, the great grand nieces and nephews, and the great great grands, and all of your friends from all over the country. We're with you, Irma and Mark, the best we can be in these times. It's been just one lunar year since we lost our brother Mark, and 2 years since our sister Laurel died. And in between, two of our sisters-in-law died, Sandy and Mert. And with so many of the elders passing on, it's so important for us to gather, to celebrate, and to tell stories. Mary Joan Mahan was born Mary Joan Blessum on April 29th, 1933. That was during the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl in the Midwest that called it the Dirty 30s. But our father was an electrical engineer for the telephone company, and we always had a house to live in and food on the table. We were very lucky. Joan's oldest brother, Norman, was born there, and her sister, Laurel, just 2 years older than Joan. Laurel and Joan were lifelong friends, so close growing up and so close in their old age. John was also born in El Paso, and then as my father's career moved forward, they moved to Albuquerque, which had been our family home for several generations. And so in Albuquerque, Laurel and Joan were old enough to ride bicycles all over the city. Joan said it was such freedom. She just loved it. And it was an adventure. You see, as a child, Joan was really adventuresome, and she caused a lot of trouble at the same time. She wasn't even allowed to go visit our great-grandmother there because she would cause too much trouble and upset her. And she got into trouble so much that one day, when Joan was playing outside and Mother called her into the house, she thought, "Oh my, what did I do this time?" But she went in, and Mom said, "Here, there's only one piece of candy left in the box. Would you like it?" And Joan remembered that all her life. It wasn't just the chocolate, which she loved so much, but the fact that even troublesome girls get love in our family. Well, in Albuquerque, Bill was born, and then Paul. Now, Paul died at 15 months of pneumonia before anybody was using penicillin. Mom never could talk about it to the rest of the family, but Joan told us. She was 8 years old, and she remembered the doctor coming and leaving, and that Paul died about an hour later. Mom washed his body and dressed him in his nicest clothes and put on him the stiff white shoes they would put on babies when they learned to walk. But Paul never had learned to walk, so those little white shoes, so perfect, stayed in Joan's memory. and she passed it on to us. It wasn't long after that that Mark was born, and the older children went to Catholic schools in Albuquerque. They went to the schools that were run by the Sisters of Loretto, and I think that's where Joan first met the sisters. My father's career moved on to a better job with the telephone company in Denver, and Elizabeth was born there. Again, they went to schools run by the Sisters of Loretto. And when the family moved to Wilmar, California, Kathy was born. But my father, when he turned 40, had his midlife crisis. He was tired of all this engineering and said he'd really always wanted to be a farmer. Never mind that there hadn't been any farmers in our family for about 3 or 4 generations. But he moved the family to a farm just outside of Albuquerque. It was an apple tree farm, but a late frost had killed all the flowers, and there wasn't much of an apple crop that year. The farm never really did do much, and so the family moved back to California. And I was born there. But when I was born, my oldest brother, Norman, had already gotten married and had a child of his own. Joan was 15 years old, and she really wanted to attend the Loretto Academy in Kansas City, a boarding school. And so she did. She came back to visit us that summer of 1949, and in the fall, Laurel entered the Carmelite Sisters, and Joan entered the Sisters of Loretto at just 16 years of age. They say in big families, the older children often leave very young. I guess there's just not enough room in the house, sometimes not enough food on the table. But for whatever reasons, it turned out to be a wonderful place for Joan to go. The Sisters of Loretto gave her a free college education and a career to follow that was very fulfilling for her. She became an English teacher, and she just loved teaching English. She loved all kinds of learning. And besides that, the Sisters of Loretto were very socially active. They were active in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and in 1962, a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. came to speak at a Baptist church. Well, I have to tell you that then Catholics were not supposed to even go into a Protestant church, and the nuns especially were not supposed to. But the Mother House gave Joan permission to attend that speech. Joan said Martin Luther King Jr. spoke calmly, but with a real fire inside. So many opportunities Joan had with the Sisters of Loretto. You know, she said there were so many children in the family that as she was growing up, she always had a baby on one hip. I think she'd had enough of children for a while, although she loved them. But you know, that changed when she moved to Albuquerque again. She was teaching at a high school in Albuquerque where a Christian brother was the principal. His name was Ralph Mahan. And the two of them talked and shared ideas. And after a while, their feelings became so strong for each other that Joan was just shocked. She didn't know what to do. She asked for a transfer back to Denver so she could go away and clear up her feelings. In Denver, her feelings didn't change. They got stronger, if anything. And she and Ralph both left their orders and married. They were married in 1974 in South Pasadena at Holy Family Church, the place where so many of us were married. Oh, you might wonder how, when she was gone so much, how did we keep attached to Joan? But we did. As a sister, Joan was able to come home about every 3 years after the first novitiate years. Her first visit home, Kathy and I were sharing a room, and we were supposed to clean our rooms, so we stuffed all of our things into our top drawer. It was a mess, but the room looked great. We brought Joan in to see our room. Someone must have ratted on us because she immediately opened that top drawer and things spilled out all over the place. Kathy and I were mortified. But Joan just laughed. She was such a tease. And I remember another time when she came to visit us when I was a teenager. And she brought a whole thick packet of mimeographed sheets of song lyrics. Now, you young people don't even remember mimeographs. They were these funny pages that were white with purple letters on them. It was the only way we had at the time of making multiple copies of something. And so Joan brought the song lyrics, and she sang all the songs to me. I had already taught myself how to play guitar chords, and after Joan went back to the convent, then I sang them to all the nieces and the nephews. And some of you might be surprised to know that your favorite song, "I'm Being Swallowed by a Boa Constrictor," really came from your Aunt Joan. But oh, the years were good. After Joan and Ralph married, they didn't go back to Albuquerque. It was really too small a town for an ex-Christian brother and an ex-nun to get jobs. So they went back to New Orleans. New Orleans is where Ralph's family was. And Ralph got a job as a principal of Chappelle High School. Now, by then, they knew that they did want children. And so Joan went back and got a master's degree in library science, adding it on to her master's degree in English. But she decided being a school librarian would be so much better for her as a mother. She had taught English long enough to know she always came home with stacks of papers to grade. But in New Orleans, she was able to go and be the librarian at Chappelle and come home without quite so much work so that she could really spend her time with Irma, who was born there. Joan went into parenting like she went into everything else. She studied everything she could about the new ways of parenting. She wanted to do everything just right, and she had her special ways. But she was always a tease. She used to tell Irma, "I carried you for 9 months, and you had the nerve to come out looking exactly like your father." Well, then they would both laugh. And later, when she would say to Irma, "Oh, you are so smart," Irma would say, "Thank you. I take after my father." And they would both laugh. Ralph and Joan both loved to entertain people, and they would have people for dinner. They would have parties for the faculty at Chappelle, and all the people who came from out of town stayed at their house. Irma said it was like having a procession of extra family members. All the sisters of Loretto were adopted aunties to her, and the rest of us came to visit her there too. And they would always take us around and show us the town and show us the area. They were fascinated by the whole culture of New Orleans. Now, when they had married, Ralph told Joan, "I have an inherited disease in my kidneys and my heart. I may only have 10 years. Joan's response was, "I want all the time I can get." And they had about 13 years together, because when Irma was just 11 years old, Ralph died. You know, he died right before Mardi Gras, and the family gathered for his funeral. I often have thought that he planned it that way. He wanted to show us Mardi Gras. And indeed, we did go to Mardi Gras parades even after his funeral, always celebrating. With Ralph gone, Joan soon started to take in other people for holiday dinners. They would invite anybody that didn't have someplace else to go. And Irma says they never had any meals alone. They always had big crowds, and they still had a lot of fun. Joan even did some cultural tours in New Orleans and at some of the plantations nearby. But when Joan retired from Chappelle, she moved to Albuquerque thinking that her retirement pay would last longer in Albuquerque because the cost of living was lower at that time in Albuquerque. And besides that, although she loved New Orleans, it had been Ralph's home, and Albuquerque was our family home. And so she moved to Albuquerque and immersed herself into everything there. She gave tours, she was involved in museums, she was even on television talking about the New Mexico history and culture. And again, people would visit her there. She'd host people, she'd take us all around Albuquerque. Always the family historian, she'd take us to the locations of all the houses our family members had lived in. And then she even took us to Silver City, where our great-great-grandparents had lived. And other people came. The Sisters of Loretto continued to come and visit because she was a companion with them all her life. And even the Bishop of Detroit stayed with her one day, saying his morning prayers in Joan's sunroom. When Joan turned 70, she had a crazy old ladies' party, and all the women in the family came. Her sisters, her nieces, her grandnieces, maybe even some great-grandnieces. It was such a great party. We wore purple, and some of the people had red hats. Everybody stood up and read a poem, told a story, sang a song. We'll all remember that party for a long time. Mark and Cynthia came to visit Joan in Albuquerque when the house next door was for sale. And for Mark and Cynthia, it was a great opportunity. They loved New Mexico and thought it would be a great place to retire someday. So they bought the house. And because Mark retired earlier than Cynthia, he had heart trouble. He came and lived in New Mexico for long periods of time. He and Joan had so much fun together. They both loved food and they loved being around people. So they would gather all sorts of people at their tables and feed them and talk long into the night. Now, Joan and Mark were about as diametrically opposed as you can imagine in politics. They would argue one side against the other and be so sure. Joan said they each knew that they were right, but she always laughed about it later. You see, it never mattered. It never mattered. Elizabeth said when she visited Albuquerque, she thought it was so much fun because Joan would get in the car and she'd pat the dashboard and say to the car, "Now, this is where we were going," and would tell it exactly where we were going that day. And there must have been some angel as autopilot for that car because they always got there. After a number of years, Bill came and stayed with Mark. And when Mark moved back to California, Bill's friend Karen Guerin moved in with him. Now, right next door to Joan, Karen said Joan was such a godsend to her. Karen was recently widowed herself and didn't know how to live as a widow. And Joan told her, "I've been there. Come over any time." And so they talked, they went places together, they laughed. And Karen, I have to say, was always so wonderful to Joan, taking her to the grocery store when she couldn't take herself. And later, when Joan couldn't really take care of herself anymore, they moved Joan into assisted living. And the family decided that it would be better for Joan to be in New Orleans near Irma, so Irma could take care of her in all the ways that you have to take care of someone in assisted living. And what a wonderful time Joan and Irma had in New Orleans. Joan was there for just over 2 years, and Irma took her out for meals to all of her favorite restaurants. Of course, I think they were all Joan's favorite. Irma said her mom was always happy any place they went. Irma would bring her Halloween outfits and pajamas with black cats and pumpkins and bats, anything that would make Joan laugh. And Joan did laugh. Now, October 6th, she was wearing the pajamas with the black cats and the pumpkins on a pale purple background. They were pajamas that Irma had exactly the same pair, and so Joan called them their twinsy pajamas. She put them on and said, "Ah, twinsies." And Irma was there, and they talked and they laughed. But when Joan got up to go to bed, she collapsed and she died so quickly. It was hard to see her go, hard to lose her, and yet such an easy death, an easy time for her, a hard time for all the rest of us. But we still have her stories, and you know, I can still hear her laughter. She would laugh at everything. Karen said when they went places, they would go start laughing as soon as they got together and still be laughing when they got home. And yes, I can hear that laugh. You know, if sometime in the night, in the dark, especially maybe around Halloween, you hear an old lady cackle, well, that might just be her telling another story and laughing. So listen and laugh with her. Thank you so much for being here today and for helping us to celebrate Joan's life. Irma, please know that we all love you so much, just as we loved your mother. Thank you.